play and call it work.
Hey everybody, Matthew here from MiniWarGaming.com, and welcome to another How to Play Warhammer 40k 8th Edition tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about setting up and deploying. So this will cover things such as how to set up your terrain, we're not going to go specifically into how all the missions work, we're going to use that in a different video, but we're going to talk about deployment types and also how to actually deploy your army. Because it can get a little confusing if you don't understand exactly how it works, and it's pivotal to how the game works because it will decide who gets to have the first turn. So as always, if you have a friend who would like to learn how to play Warhammer 40k 8th Edition, tell them to go to MiniWarGaming.com/how-to-play-40k. Let's take a look at the rules. I don't want to spend too much of this video talking about terrain, as we are going to cover that in another tutorial where we'll talk about terrain and cover and how all that works. But I wanted to show you an example table that's set up that I just threw together really quickly. And the way I like to build tables, and this is all going to be very subjective, there is no exact wording for how you do terrain or how much you're supposed to do. But I like to make sure there's enough terrain to block line of sight to certain areas, to provide cover where necessary. Cover is still a part of the game. It's not as much a part of the game as in 7th edition, but it is still a part of the game, especially line of sight blocking stuff so that your opponent can't just sit back and fire wherever they want. You need to kind of create it in such a way that has some dynamics to it. I also love terrain because of how cool it looks, and so I try to do that. I try to make the board not asymmetrical, and that way it matters what side you choose. We'll be talking about scenarios in a different video, but essentially the scenario will tell you the order of operations for how you decide the deployment map and how you decide who goes first. But most of them work a similar way. If there are objectives, you'll roll off, and then that decides who places the objectives first. And then whoever places the last objective determines the deployment type. Now in match play, that will be randomly determined. You roll on D6 and there is a page that you refer to. And I refer to the standard deployment maps on page 216. Some specific scenarios will tell you the deployment maps, but a lot of the match play ones will tell you to determine them, and the player who determines them rolls a die and it determines which one of these that you do. You can see they all have vastly different setups. Some of them are set up along the short edge of the table, some of them along the long edge, some of them quarters, some of them diagonals, and some of them are variations on the two, where this one takes the middle and it pulls it forward, but then takes the sides and pulls it back and creates the frontline assault. And the spearhead assault does the same thing to hammer and anvil. It takes the middle, pulls it forward, but takes the sides and pulls it back. So you get this little extra area of being closer to the enemy, but then you have this area which is further away from the enemy. So obviously these ones are favorable to close combat armies, and these ones are favorable to shooting armies because these ones you can start closer to your opponent, and the other ones you start further away. No matter, whoever determines the deployment map will typically be the one to determine which side they get to choose. So if you're the one that rolls it and you roll Dawn of War, then you look at the table and you're like, okay, that'll be here and that'll be there, and then you get to choose which side that you will have. After that, the scenario once again tell you who deploys first, but typically whoever did not choose the deployment map or their side is the one to start deploying first. This will be much easier to demonstrate if I actually show you how it works rather than just talking about it, because it can sound complicated until you see it in action. So I have two example armies here. I have a Space Marine army and I have a Tyranid army. These, I didn't even check points values or power levels or detachments. We're just going to assume that both of these are battle forged. It doesn't really matter for this video whether they are or not, because we're just talking about how you deploy. So let's assume the Tyranid player got to choose which side of the table that they're going to be on. And the scenario then states that whoever did not choose gets to set up first. Well, then what you do in most scenarios is you alternate deploying. That whoever gets to set up chooses one of their units and deploys it on the table in their deployment zone, and then their opponent chooses a unit, deploys it on the table in their deployment zone, and you go back and forth until both sides are done. If one side finishes before the other, well then the other just keeps placing units until they are finished. Typically in a scenario, whoever finishes deploying first or setting up first gets to choose who has first or second turn. This is a pretty big deal, as having first turn can be very important, or giving up first turn can be very important to certain armies as well. And if you choose yourself, so if you're the one that gets to choose who has first turn and you choose yourself, then your opponent can typically in a scenario try to seize the initiative, which is simply rolling a d6, and if they roll a 6, they get to go first instead. But it's not just as simple as that, because a lot of units will have special rules, and we also have to talk about how transports work in order for this to go forward. But the first special rule I want to talk about, and this is a army-specific rule, so you really need to read the rules for each of the units in your army to see if they have any specific rules. But I want to talk about this one because it's very common, and that is combat squads for Space Marines. Now, basically, there are a few units such as Scouts, Tactical Marines, Bike Squads, Assault Squads, and some others that have the combat squad rule, which states, in the case of the Scouts, if you have 10 models in your unit, then before deployment starts, you can break them up into 2 5-man squads that'll act as separate squads for the remainder of the game. So if I wanted to, I've got this 10-man unit of Scouts, 5 of them with bolters and shotguns, the other 5 with missile launchers and snipers. I can say, well, even though I bought this as one troop choice, I am going to combat squad them. So we are going to separate the snipers and the missile launcher, for example, from the rest of the squad. And why you'd want to do that, well, that gets more into tactics, but there are certain advantages and disadvantages. But now they are 2 squads. All the rules now, who cares that they were brought as one squad, they now act as 2 squads, which means they deploy one at a time. Furthermore, certain things do have special rules for deploying, which we'll show. So let's do some demonstration of how this would go. Let's say the Space Marine player gets to go first for setting up. So he chooses a unit. I'll choose these Hellblasters, and he sets them up on the table. We'll say that we're doing the Dawn of War deployment, which is the long table edge, just 12 inches up the table. So then I would take my Hellblasters, and let's say this is my table side, just for ease. I would then deploy them on the table fully within 12 inches of my side, which I know to be about up to here, so I'm not even going to bother measuring. Remember, we're not worried about that right now. We're just worried about showing how the alternating deployment goes. Now that I've deployed, the Tyranid player chooses one and deploys them on the table. So let's say the Tyranid player chooses his Biovore squad. It's a squad of 3, so I'll take those. And they're long-range artillery, so we'll stick them in the corner over here, wholly within my deployment zone. So if the deployment zone line was here, I could not have him hanging over the line. He has to be wholly within it. And in unit coherency too. The Space Marine player then says, well, I want to put one of my Vindicators on the table. So he takes it and puts it wholly in his deployment zone. Now let's get a little funky. Let's start talking about some weird deployments or setting up. We're going to choose one of these Lictors, who is a unit, he's an elite. And the Lictors have a special rule saying that's called Hidden Hunters. During deployment, you can set up a Lictor in hiding instead of placing it on the battlefield. At the end of any of your movement phases, the Lictor can spring up from its hiding place, set it up anywhere on the battlefield that is more than 9 inches away from enemy models. Now, there are a lot of things that have a rule that works almost identically to this, but they call it different things. So I'm going to choose a Lictor, and I'm going to say I'm going to set him up in hiding. Now, just to represent that, I'm going to take him and I'm going to stick him in the back here, just so we don't get confused that I haven't set him up yet. So this still counts as me choosing a guy and setting him up. So now it's the Space Marine's turn. The Inceptors have a special rule as well, which basically allows them to drop in from the sky, but it's exactly the same rule as a Lictor, with only one difference. A Lictor can reroll his failed charges the turn that he comes in from hiding, but other than that, these guys work exactly the same. So we're going to pick them, and we're going to stick them back here. They're going to be up in the sky, getting ready to drop down at the end of any movement phase. The Tyranid player then says, well, you know what, I'll stick my other Lictor in hiding as well. The nice advantage of this is that your opponent has no idea where they're going to be on the board. Now let's talk about transports. This Rhino is a transport. It has a transport keyword, and it has a specific rule that says it can transport up to 10 models. It then specifies what it can and cannot transport. For example, it cannot transport anything with Primaris keywords, which unfortunately these Primaris Marines have and these 2 characters have. But when you take a transport, and don't break it, it's actually supposed to do that, and you deploy it on the table, at the same time that you set it up, you declare everything that is inside of it. For example, I'm going to say that these 5 Scouts are inside of that Rhino. So I'm just going to put them aside. And I can actually keep going. If I wanted to, I could put these 5 Scouts in there as well, because there is room for them. You can have multiple units within the same transport. The only rule is your entire unit has to fit inside the transport. So if there was 6 Marines here, I couldn't put 5 of them inside of it and 1 of them outside of it. They're either all in or all out. Now, I'm not going to put them in, but what I will do is I'll take this Space Marine captain and I'll put him in the transport with those Scouts. I can't place any more characters in there because these ones are Primaris Marines, and Primaris Marines can't go inside of Rhinos. But if they weren't Primaris Marines, I could keep loading up the Rhino until it was totally full. And those all count as one setup. So that did not count as 3 setups. And I have to declare what's inside of it when I put the Rhino on the table. The Tyranids have access to a dedicated transport as well. It works a little different, so you have to make sure you read its specific rules, but deployment is pretty much the same, and that's the Tyrannocyte, or the drop pod. So when it deploys, you can set it up in orbit, basically inside of one of the hive ships, and so it does not go on the table, and when it lands, it has to be more than 9 inches away from the nearest enemy model, just like we see with a lot of the other ones. But it can actually, when set up in that deployment, can take either one monster with it or a unit of 20 infantry. And so let's say, for example, I want to take this Swarmlord and stick it inside. But you know what I'm actually going to do, just to keep it nice and simple, is I'm going to take this unit of 3 Pyrovores and set it up inside. So just like the dedicated transport, this all counts as one setup. So they are now deployed. Let's say the Space Marine chooses these scouts next. Now the scouts also have a special rule called concealed position. And this rule is, when they are deployed, they can be deployed anywhere on the table that is more than 9 inches away from the enemy deployment zone. And so this one's not like the other ones where you stick them in reserve and then they come on at the end of turn 1 or one of your movement phases. These guys can go anywhere on the table as long as they're at least 9 inches away from the enemy deployment zone. This allows them to have more of a forward position if you want, or just to kind of be placed almost anywhere on the table. Now the enemy deployment zone will be about here, 12 inches up, so there's another 9 inches to here, so they could deploy as far forward as that. But this allows them to deploy outside of their deployment, but they're still set up when they're deployed. So you have to read their specific rule to see, are they set up when they're set up, or are they put in reserve? When do they come in? Where can they be placed on the table? If they have no rules that talk about that, then you assume you just put them on the table in your deployment zone. The Sporosis has a variation on the deployment rule where you come in at the end of the turn. He can be placed in a hive ship as well, but instead of the end of the movement phase, at the beginning of the first battle round, but before the first turn begins, then you place him on the table more than 9 inches away from any enemy model. So I'll say that, yeah, we'll stick him in the hive ship as well, but he'll come in at a different time than these other ones. Then the Space Marine player chooses their Vindicator and decides to put it over here. He doesn't have to put it with the other Vindicator, but he decides he wants to. The Tyranid player takes their Swarmlord, places it fully within their deployment zone. Space Marine player then takes their 10-man squad of Intercessors and places it wholly within their deployment zone. The Tyranid player then has a unit of 3 Carnifexes. Now this unit of Carnifexes has a special rule that you'll see this kind of common across a lot of armies with big things like this, where they're bought as a single heavy support choice of 1 to 3 Carnifexes, but when they are deployed, they all deploy together within 6 inches of each other, but after that they act independently. So even though this was purchased as a unit, their special rule says that, well, they're not actually a unit, they're going to go independent of each other, but when they deploy, they have to be within 6 inches of at least one other model from this group. So I'll deploy them nice and close together like this, but they don't have to be within unit coherency, just 6 inches. And then once the game starts, these guys are all individual units for all purposes of the rules. Space Marine player then takes their captain, places him back here to give his little aura bonus to these guys. Tyranid player then takes his unit of Venomthropes and places them back behind the Carnifexes. Space Marine player only has 1 unit left, which is the Standard Bearer. So he takes that, places it on the table, and he is done. And he is done before the Tyranid player, which means he will get to dictate who goes first. The Tyranid player has 1 more unit, but if he had more than 1 more, we would just deploy the rest of them now. He puts them wholly in his deployment zone. The Space Marine player will then declare who goes first. Often you're going to choose yourself, but that's not always the case. In this case, the Space Marine player says, yes, I want to go first. The Tyranid player, in most scenarios, will have the option to seize the initiative. You have to make sure the scenario specifies this, otherwise you can't do it. If that is an option, then all you have to do is he rolls a die, and if he rolls a 6, then he gets to go first instead of his opponent. In this case, I rolled a 2, so the Space Marine player will go first. Now that we've determined who's going first, we have to remember anything with special rules that happened at the beginning of the first battle round happen now. The Sporosis special rule says when it's in the hive ship, before the first player's turn on the first battle round, you place it anywhere on the table that is more than 9 inches away from the enemy. So I'll just stick it right here. It doesn't have to be in my deployment zone. It could be in my opponent's deployment zone, as long as the model is more than 9 inches away from the enemy model. Now make sure that when it says more than, that you actually do more than. So 9 1/4 or 9 1/8, but it has to be more than 9 inches. The Space Marine player will then take their first turn. Let's just pretend that we're going to do a quick movement phase here. So they're going to move up, the Rhino moves up, and these guys all decide to stand still. So now it's the end of their movement phase. They have a unit of Inceptors that says at the end of any movement phase, they can be placed anywhere on the table more than 9 inches away from an enemy model. So I'm going to have these guys drop here, This is in the enemy's deployment zone, but as long as they're more than 9 inches away from the enemy, which they are, then they're good. They cannot further move. They count as having moved if it matters for their weapons. They can't advance. This is at the end of the movement phase, so for all intents and purposes, this is their move. We would then proceed to the psychic, shooting, charge, fight phase, all in the morale phase, and do the rest of the turn. And then when the Tyranids go, they would move, and at the end of their movement, they could choose their guys to come on in. Now let's show you how the Tyrannocyte works, just as an example. First off, the Tyrannocyte has to be placed on the table anywhere that's more than 9 inches away from an enemy model. So it could be in their deployment zone, could be in your deployment zone. In this case, I'm making sure that I'm more than 9 inches away from the scouts and from these Hellblasters. The Tyrannocyte has a special rule that says the unit that was brought with it or embarked upon it must immediately disembark. This breaks the normal rules of transports, which say that you have to disembark at the beginning of the movement rather than the end. And when they disembark, so they have to be placed within 3 inches, just like the normal transport rules. But in the Tyrannocyte special rules, it says these models must be at least 9 inches away from any enemy models. So this will be a little too close. So we might have to shuffle these around to make sure that we're not too close to that. Or we might actually have to move the Tyrannocyte back so that these guys can come out where I want them to come out. Either way, both of these count as having moved, and they cannot move any further or advance. Unless specified otherwise, models that come in these fashions are still able to shoot. They can still do psychic powers. They can still charge or fight in the fight phase if it does come up. Obviously, the charging is going to be a little harder because they'll be more than 9 inches away, which means normally they'll have a 9-inch charge that they have to do. But it doesn't stop them from doing any of those things. So if you come from 7th edition and you're used to the idea that when you come in from reserves, you cannot charge, well, that is not the case. Unless your special rule tells you that you cannot charge, you can charge. If it tells you that you cannot shoot, then you can't shoot. Otherwise, you can. So it has to specifically tell you that you can't do it. Otherwise, they just count as having moved to that location for all intents and purposes. That's all there is to learn about setting up and deploying. Now, there's a lot of tactics that are involved with this. There's an enormous amount of tactics that are involved with how you set up and how you deploy, how you choose what to hold back in reserve, and how you choose where to put your guys. But that's not what we're trying to cover here. We're just trying to get your mind wrapped around how deployment works. Some common mistakes are people thinking that if I have something that's hidden or does not get put on the table, it doesn't count towards the number of units that are getting deployed back and forth, but it does. It just says when it's set up, you do these things. So make sure you're following those rules exactly as written, that you look at the specific data slate of what you're doing to make sure that there's not minor modifications to any of the rules that I told you, because things can break their own rules just as long as they have a rule to do so. And to really help you with this, we have a battle report where I made sure that the opponents really focused on having different types of deployment and transports, so you can see how those all work together during setup. And they definitely did record the entire deployment, so you can see it in action at the link in the video description below, which is of course in the MiniWarGaming Vault. If you're not a Vault member yet, you can still click it, get a free 7-day trial, get access to all the battle reports for all these tutorials, plus thousands of others, painting tutorials, and all sorts of other stuff. And of course, if you have a friend who'd like to learn how to play Warhammer 40k 8th edition, tell them to go to miniwargaming.com/how-to-play 40k. I'll see you in the next tutorial.